Marcus Richardson was used to airports. It was easier to find him 10,000 meters above ground than in his own home. On that specific day, a rainy March Wednesday, he was boarding yet another Skylux Airlines flight, departing from New York bound for San Francisco, where he had a crucial meeting with Asian investors. Seat 2A was always the same: spacious, guaranteed silence, a foldable table sturdy enough to support his laptop, and an ideal distance from the cabin to avoid interruptions. For Marcus, that place was not just a seat, it was a small floating office where multi-million-dollar decisions were made. He wore a tailored navy blue suit, a minimalist titanium watch, and carried a worn leather briefcase that had accompanied him since the days he sold custom algorithms in the basement of a co-working space in Chicago. Before the story continues, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, like, and enable notifications. This helps me keep bringing transformative accounts like this one. Despite his serene expression and focused gaze, Marcus felt the accumulated fatigue of months without a vacation. However, nothing could have prepared him for what would happen in the minutes following boarding. As he organized his documents on the armrest tray, a middle-aged woman with fair skin, carefully wavy blonde hair, wearing an expensive beige outfit and an intense citrus perfume, stopped in front of him with an indignant expression. "This is my seat," she said, as if stating the obvious. Without even considering the possibility of being mistaken, Marcus, politely, showed his digital boarding pass with the number 2A highlighted. The woman was not satisfied. In just a few moments, flight attendant Jessica Miller approached, with a protocol smile that concealed a certain discomfort, and there, in that narrow, dimly lit aisle, began one of the most degrading experiences of Marcus's life. A moment he would never forget. The situation, which could have been resolved with a simple system check, began to escalate in a disconcerting way. Jessica, still smiling, asked to see Marcus's boarding pass, as if the image on his phone were not enough. Marcus handed over his phone, remaining calm, though he already felt a familiar discomfort rising in the pit of his stomach, a specific type of unease he had learned to recognize since he was the only black student in his public school's math Olympiad. Jessica examined the screen with excessive attention, then turned to Karen and, with little conviction, asked the lady to show her boarding pass as well. Karen, with a theatrical air, rummaged through her designer purse for an exaggerated amount of time before declaring that she always sat there on every Skylux flight and that something must be wrong with the system. When she finally showed her boarding pass, Marcus realized that her seat was 3C, but no one seemed to care about that detail. The tone of the conversation changed when the cabin supervisor, Trevor, was called. Tall, pale, with a sparse mustache and a rigid expression, he looked Marcus up and down before even introducing himself. Trevor spoke to Marcus as if instructing someone who had invaded a place they did not belong. He used polite words, but his tone carried the same condescension that Marcus had heard hundreds of times in other contexts. He said there was a confusion, and that it was better to avoid embarrassment. Marcus, still seated, responded firmly but without raising his voice, explaining that he was a platinum member, that this was his usual seat, and that he had booked weeks in advance. Trevor seemed to ignore every word. It was at that moment that Karen, with an almost imperceptible gesture, slipped something into the supervisor's hands. It wasn't possible to see exactly what, but the movement was quick and discreet, like someone who already knew how that dynamic worked. Marcus noticed, and he wasn't the only one. A couple 2 seats back exchanged glances, and the man discreetly took out his phone. Something had changed in the air. What had started as a seat dispute was now taking on contours of something much deeper, much dirtier. Marcus leaned back in his seat, crossed his arms, and took a deep breath. He knew exactly what was happening. He had already faced similar situations at gala dinners, meetings with investment funds, and even TV interviews. But there on that plane, surrounded by strangers, it was different. It was raw. There were no professional cameras or scripts. It was just him, the truth, and the invisible structure that still questioned his place in the world. Jessica returned, now accompanied by another, younger flight attendant who seemed uncomfortable with the situation. They asked Marcus to cooperate so that the flight could take off on time. They used that passive-aggressive tone that seems polite but pressures without giving any real option. Karen, on the other hand, was already seated in seat 3C, watching everything with a victorious little smile, as if that game had been won even before it began. Marcus kept his composure but decided he would go all the way. He took his phone out of his pocket and began recording. "My name is Marcus Richardson. I am on Skylux Airlines Flight 2746, Seat 2A, reserved and confirmed. I am being asked to leave this seat without a valid justification, even though I have all the proofs. I demand transparency." He said everything firmly and without hesitation, looking directly into the camera. Jessica tried to stop him, saying that recordings were not allowed, but he was not intimidated. Within seconds, his recording had already attracted the attention of other passengers, some of whom started filming as well. Trevor, who had previously maintained control of the situation, now hesitated. The phone that Karen had discreetly handed over was still on Marcus's mind. He knew what he had seen, and more than that, he knew what it represented. It wasn't just about him, it was about everyone who had ever been silenced for not fitting into the standard image of the ideal customer. The tension inside the cabin was palpable. The ambient sound, previously composed of zippers closing on bags and passengers adjusting seatbelts, was taken over by a strange silence, as if everyone was waiting for the next move. Trevor whispered with Jessica, visibly irritated by the repercussions. Karen, unsettled by the cameras pointed at her, began to try to seem less involved, as if she had just been a passenger in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Marcus knew that this was not an isolated case. It was a clear portrait of a system shaped to favor some and delegitimize others. All around, looks were shifting. Some passengers expressed support with subtle gestures, a nod, a sympathetic glance. Others averted their eyes, uncomfortable. The young attendant accompanying Jessica murmured an almost inaudible "sorry" as he passed by Marcus. That said a lot. When the captain finally spoke over the intercom, asking the passengers for patience due to a small setback, Marcus let out a short, ironic laugh. A small setback. Was that how years of struggle, achievements, humiliations, and overcoming were summed up? He looked around and realized that the recording was not just evidence, it was his armor. His voice, recorded there, would be heard. The phone in his hand, more than just a device, was now a shield against the manipulation of facts. When Trevor returned, and with a mechanical smile, informed him that Marcus would be reseated in another equally comfortable seat, something inside him broke. It wasn't about comfort. It was about dignity, about being treated like any other passenger who paid for their own place, about not being displaced because someone accustomed decided that 2A was theirs by right. And at that moment, Marcus understood. It wasn't enough just to resist. It was time to react. Marcus got up slowly, unhurried, and looked directly at his phone's camera while recording every detail, the faces of the crew, Karen's expression, the discomfort of the other passengers. He calmly put away his laptop, as if closing a chapter, and headed down the aisle without saying a word. When he passed by Trevor, he only said what was necessary. "You know what just happened here." The short, cold phrase seemed to echo in the cramped space of first class. Trevor looked away. Jessica, visibly nervous, tried to justify something about higher orders, but Marcus did not reply. He walked to the new indicated seat, 4D, and sat down without even taking off his coat. The space was smaller, the environment tighter, and the window view almost non-existent. He regarded the seat back in front of him as if it were the reflection of everything he had always needed to overcome to get where he was. Seated there, he began to type. First, he sent a short message to his assistant. "I need this sent to legal today." Then, he opened his notes app and began to organize everything that had happened. Time, names, gestures, phrases. It was almost instinctive, like someone who learned early on that only those who record, who document, who transform pain into evidence, survive. As he wrote, memories flooded his mind. He remembered when, at 12 years old, he was accused of stealing a mouse in the school computer lab simply for holding one identical to the one in the room that he had bought with money earned from printer repair jobs. Or the day he was prevented from entering a corporate event even though he was the main speaker. That situation on that plane was not new. What was new was the strength he now had to not let it pass. And more than that, to make the world listen. The takeoff was tense. No one dared to say much, but it was clear that the atmosphere had changed. The crew did everything to appear professional, but there was hesitation in their gestures, wary exchanged glances, and a contained hurry in every movement. Marcus remained, silent yet alert. He recorded discreetly with his phone, capturing audios, side conversations, whispers in the background. More than indignant, he was determined. Every second of that experience would be converted into action. He knew the power of the image, of the exposed truth. It wasn't the first time he had thought about how companies hide behind well-written policies that, in practice, do not prevent bias, prejudice, or covert racism. And he knew better than most the mechanisms that perpetuated that kind of behavior. After all, his company worked with behavioral prediction algorithms, many of which he had created to avoid injustices in hiring processes and automated judgments. While the plane gained altitude, Marcus thought of his father, Calvin Richardson, a steelworker who used to say, "Son, your name will be the first one in the room, so make sure it is respected." Calvin had died when Marcus was 17, a victim of a nighttime cardiac arrest. It was he who gave Marcus his first computer, a vintage model rescued from factory scrap and repaired piece by piece. Back then, Marcus spent entire nights trying to understand lines of code copied from foreign forums. It was there that the passion was born, which, years later, would give rise to Aegis AI, the company that would revolutionize corporate security systems worldwide. Thinking of all that at that moment made his chest tighten, not because of what he was living, but because he knew that even after everything, it was still possible to be reduced to the color of one's skin, and for that reason, he would not let that story die inside that plane. Next to Marcus, a middle-aged man, bald with tired features and a Skylux badge hanging around his neck, observed everything with some discomfort. He said nothing for a few minutes until, discreetly, he leaned in and spoke in a low voice. "I saw what happened up front. It was wrong. And this isn't the first time it's happened." Marcus slowly turned, stared at the man, trying to understand if he was an ally or just another regretful bystander. The man continued, "I've seen people being moved from their seats through backroom deals, but this time it went too far." Marcus nodded, without committing to the conversation. He had learned over time that true positioning didn't come in a hushed tone, but in firm actions. Even so, that small confession gave him the certainty that what he had witnessed was not an isolated case. It was a practice, an undeclared impolicy, but one that was allowed, and perhaps even encouraged. Shortly before the in-flight service, Marcus received a notification. One of the videos recorded by a passenger was already circulating on social networks. In less than 20 minutes, the content had been shared over 1,000 times, with captions such as "CEO removed from seat for being black" and "Skylux Airlines, is that right?" Marcus's face was already appearing on activist profile pages, news blogs, and aviation forums. For a moment, he felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He knew the power of social networks, but he also knew the risks of sudden exposure. He took a deep breath, straightened his posture, and began replying to some messages. Colleagues, friends, executives from other companies, all outraged. One message in particular caught his attention. It was from an important investor who had written only, "Let's talk when we land. This can't go on." That was when Marcus understood that the fight that had started in a cramped airplane aisle was just beginning. As the plane headed toward the west coast, the tension continued to hover in the air. Jessica avoided passing through the aisle where Marcus was, and Trevor confined himself to discreetly patrolling the cabin, pretending not to notice the disapproving looks. Marcus, for his part, kept his eyes glued to his phone. Comments were multiplying in real time. Among messages of support, there were also those questioning, doubting, or belittling him. Maybe it was just a mistake. He's overreacting. He should have just stood up and avoided trouble. Phrases he had seen before in different forms in other battles. But what affected him was not the content of those messages, but the pattern. The ease with which some people trivialized an injustice as long as it didn't happen to them. That irritated him, but did not shake him. He had already developed a kind of emotional armor that protected him from superficialities. Now, more than ever, he was convinced of what needed to be done. Upon landing in San Francisco, Marcus was the last to disembark. He made a point of waiting for all the passengers, letting the cabin empty out. He wanted to see the crew's faces, without the veil of routine. Jessica passed by him quickly, avoiding eye contact. Trevor stared at him for a second, but without the courage to start any conversation. Karen, on the other hand, made a point of hurrying to get up, still with an air of false elegance, as if trying to preserve an image in the face of an imminent scandal. Marcus remained standing at the aircraft door until the very last second. When he finally stepped onto the jet bridge, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He was exhausted, but resolute, and even before reaching the arrivals hall, his team had already sent out a press release. The story was officially out in the open, and Marcus, instead of hiding, decided to go straight to the front line. The press conference was scheduled for the late afternoon in a modest auditorium inside the Aegis AI headquarters. It wasn't a planned event, but Marcus's team acted quickly. Local journalists, independent bloggers, and even major national media were present. When he entered the room, wearing the same blue suit from the flight and holding the phone he had used to record everything, the attention was immediate. But it wasn't just because of the notoriety of the case. It was because of the way he carried himself. There was no anger in his gestures, no haste in his words. Marcus was there with a clear purpose: to transform indignation into a proposal. After detailing the incident and presenting the videos, he got straight to the point. "What happened to me happens to many people every day, but not everyone has visibility. Not everyone has a voice. I do, and therefore, I will not be silenced." The phrase was spoken firmly, without theatrics, and it was met with the concentrated silence of those who understood they were witnessing something important. At the end of the interview, Marcus announced the creation of a program called Second Chance, an initiative funded by Aegis AI itself to retrain aviation professionals dismissed for misconduct, offering training in ethics, diversity, and humanized service. The proposal wasn't about saving reputations, but about creating a viable path for change. People make mistakes, but some are so trapped in a flawed system that they no longer even realize how much they operate on the autopilot of prejudice. If we want transformation, we need to provide tools, and we need to demand results, he said, looking directly into the cameras. The reaction was immediate. Headlines spread. Business leaders praised the initiative, and black rights activists highlighted his stance as an example of anti-racist leadership. But what touched Marcus the most was an anonymous message that arrived hours later. "Thank you for not lowering your head. Today, you spoke for me too. Skylux Airlines reacted the next day with a hasty generic statement, claiming operational misunderstandings and promising an internal investigation. But the video had already reached millions of views, and Marcus's name dominated social media trends. It was too late to neutralize the impact. Within the airline itself, there was panic. Emergency meetings were convened, and the executive board was split between trying to protect the brand and finding someone to blame. Richard Williams, Skylux's CEO, knew that the case jeopardized not only the company's image, but also a billion-dollar exclusive contract with an international alliance. Internally, documents began to leak, revealing that Seat 2A had indeed been manually changed minutes before boarding, following a special request from a VIP client, Karen Wickfield. And more gravely, a safety report confirmed that there was no technical or security reason to justify Marcus's reallocation. Meanwhile, Marcus refused interviews for entertainment programs. He preferred to speak with outlets committed to serious journalism and to use his social networks to directly engage with people. He knew that the focus couldn't be on him, but on the system that allowed this to happen. Invitations started coming for lectures, diversity forums, and corporate equity debates, but he turned down many of them. He didn't want to become a symbol. He wanted to provoke a movement. One evening, sitting alone in his home office, he reread an email sent by a former Skylux employee that said, "I was trained to smile, not to question. Thank you for opening a crack in the wall we thought was impenetrable." That message resonated in his mind for hours. Perhaps that was it. His role wasn't to tear down walls all at once, but to show that cracks exist, and that, with courage and intention, they can be turned into passageways. In the following days, the pressure on Skylux increased exponentially. Major brands sponsoring the airline began suspending their campaigns, demanding a firmer stance. A collective action by customers was organized by consumer rights groups, and Marcus's video was used as evidence in lawsuits. Faced with impending collapse, Skylux had no choice. They fired Jessica, Trevor, and 2 other involved employees and announced a complete overhaul of their service protocols. The decision was met with skepticism by the public, who saw it as yet another attempt to clean up, rather than a real commitment to change. For Marcus, however, something had shifted, not because of the punishment, but because of the movement. That episode ceased to be an isolated case and became a symbol, a warning, a turning point. Meanwhile, Karen Wickfield disappeared from social networks. Her publicist released an evasive statement saying that she regretted what happened and was cooperating with the authorities. Marcus did not seek revenge. He never had, but he made sure that responsibility was taken. In a post that went viral, he wrote, "The problem was never Karen. The problem is what allows hundreds of Karens to be protected while others are pushed out of their rights." The post garnered millions of likes and opened up space for accounts from others who had experienced similar situations. In flights, hotels, companies, restaurants, stories that intertwined with his, creating a network of voices that had once been silent. And by realizing that collective connection, Marcus understood that the real impact of everything wasn't just in the repercussion, it was in the multiplier effect of courage. A firm gesture in the right place could trigger much more than he had ever imagined. Marcus's routine had changed drastically. Even with the Aegis AI team handling part of operations, his schedule was filled with interviews with lawyers, meetings with civil rights groups, and invitations to lead debates on equity in the corporate market. Yet among all that, he made sure to keep something sacred: Saturday, mornings with his mother. Ever since he became CEO, that routine was one of the few weekly respites. They would sit at the same modest cafe where the owner already knew his usual order by heart: black coffee and cheese bread without cream cheese. On that Saturday, she held her son's hand a little longer than usual and said in a low yet firm voice, "Your father would be proud, but don't forget to rest too. A tired hero doesn't change the world." Marcus smiled, moved. He didn't need trophies, headlines, or tributes. What he truly wanted was for no one else to have to go through what he went through. It was on that very day that he received an unexpected email. Subject: Urgent Partnership, Corporate Anti-Discrimination Program. The sender was Richard Williams, CEO of Skylux. The email was direct and surprisingly personal. In it, Richard acknowledged the company's mistakes, expressed his shame, and conveyed his intention to implement structural changes, starting with a mandatory training program developed based on the principles of second chance. The invitation included a face-to-face meeting without the press, without publicists, just the two of them. Marcus read the email 3 times before responding. He knew the weight of that decision. Accepting meant sitting at the table with those who had allowed his humiliation, but it also meant having the chance to directly influence the reconstruction of a sick corporate culture. He replied with 3 words, without any roundabout: "Let's talk, Marcus." The meeting took place in a modest room on the 17th floor of Skylux's headquarters in Manhattan. Richard Williams waited at the head of the glass table, without bodyguards, without intermediaries. Upon seeing him, Marcus noticed the wear on the executive's face: deep, dark circles, a dejected expression, and a slight tremor in his hands. It was evident that the crisis had taken its toll. Even so, Marcus maintained his posture, shoulders straight, gaze firm, and a folder with notes in his hand. After a brief handshake, Richard began to speak. He did not try to justify himself. He admitted the error, the company's permissive culture, and above all, his own omission. He said the case had forced him to face uncomfortable truths about himself and the bubble he lived in. "I lost control of the culture I built," he confessed. Marcus listened in silence, without interrupting, until Richard ended with a question. "Do you believe it's possible to change this from the inside out?" Marcus took a few seconds to answer. He looked out the window, where tall buildings reflected New York's cold afternoon, and then spoke with the calm of someone who thinks before acting. "I believe that real change doesn't start with company manuals. It starts when discomfort turns into action. And for that, it has to hurt. It has to shake your pride. It has to become a priority." Then he opened the folder and placed on the table a structured proposal with steps, impact, metrics, mandatory reports, and independent external consultancies. It wasn't a request. It was a condition. Richard read in silence for a few minutes and, without looking up, simply nodded. The ensuing silence was more eloquent than any speech. At that moment, 2 completely different stories intersected, not by coincidence, but by consequence. And there, without photos or an audience, Marcus initiated what would become one of the greatest ethical reform programs in the history of commercial aviation. The news of the partnership between Marcus Richardson and Skylux caused mixed reactions. Part of the public praised the initiative, seeing in it an example of mature and strategic reconciliation. Another, more skeptical part, accused Marcus of covering up or of giving in to corporate power. He had expected that. He knew that any step toward real change would require the courage to withstand misunderstandings. What mattered to him was that the gears were starting to turn. Weeks after the meeting, the first training sessions with Skylux employees began. Instead of cold videos and rigid manuals, the meetings included open discussions, real-life simulations, and testimonies from people who had either suffered or committed discriminatory acts. Marcus personally participated in some of these sessions. In one of them, he heard a former in-flight supervisor, visibly moved, confess that he had acted out of prejudice, simply out of habit. "I was just following the flow. I never stopped to think about what I was doing to others." After that session, Marcus stopped in the corridor for a few minutes alone. Leaning against the white wall of the training center, he took a deep breath. That was it. It was real. They weren't just apologies, nor marketing maneuvers. People were beginning to think, to question, to rethink. Of course, not everyone would change. Of course, there would be resistance, sabotage, cynicism. But at that moment, he was certain it was worth it. He called his mother, as he always did when something important happened. When she answered, he simply said, "It's working, Mom. It's really working." On the other end of the line, she wept silently, just as she had since the day she saw her son, still a boy, being frisked by a security guard at the local market for carrying a backpack too old for the customer standard. Now, that same boy was helping teach large companies to see the value in every person, regardless of appearance. And if this account is touching you in any way, share it with someone. Sometimes a story like this comes at exactly the right time for another person. The Second Chance program gradually gained strength and was adopted little by little by other companies beyond Skylux. Transportation companies, hotel chains, and even banks began to seek Marcus and his team to adapt the model to each sector's reality. It wasn't a facade project. It involved data, psychological follow-up, behavior evaluation, and above all, active listening. Many of the professionals who went through the training returned to the market with a different attitude. Some even became multipliers of the initiative. Trevor, the cabin supervisor who had accepted Karen's bribe, was one of them. After months of silence, he approached Marcus on his own, asking to participate in the program as a student, not as a defendant. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to understand how I became that guy," he said. Marcus thought for days before accepting, but he did accept because he knew that real transformation would never be clean or quick, and sometimes it came from the humility of the one responsible for the mistake. At a closed event, nearly a year after the incident on the flight, Trevor took the stage and told his story to a group of new Skylux trainees. He spoke without mincing words about what happened, what he felt, what he lost. He said that what hurt the most was not the firing or the public exposure, but realizing that for years he had been operating in the automatic mode of an exclusionary system. "I was good at maintaining order, but I never stopped to think if the order I was keeping was just," he confessed, his voice choked. Marcus watched silently from the audience. He did not applaud at the end. He simply got up, went over to Trevor, and extended his hand. The gesture, simple and direct, was enough. No more words were needed. There were two men who had lived on opposite sides of the same story, and who, in different ways, decided to break the cycle. Over time, Marcus returned to dedicating himself more intensively to Aegis AI, now strengthened not only by technological innovation, but by the public image of ethical, engaged leadership. Investors who had previously hesitated to associate their brands with social causes now approached him, aware that purpose and profit were not incompatible. The Flight 2746 case was studied at universities, cited in academic articles, and used as an example in leadership training programs. Despite this, Marcus never romanticized what he had lived through. Whenever he was invited to speak about the episode, he made sure to say, "I gained nothing from that. I lost peace, sleep, energy, but I transformed that into action. And that, yes, was my choice." People saw him as a symbol of overcoming, but he saw himself as someone who, faced with a closed door, chose to push until it opened. Not to pass alone, but to keep it open for others. Still, there were difficult days. Days when he woke up reliving that feeling of being measured, tested, watched. The trauma hadn't vanished. It had settled into a corner of his memory, ready to emerge when least expected. In those moments, he sought refuge in small things. A morning run in the park at dawn, unsweetened coffee at the corner bar, or simply watching the city move from the window of his apartment. One such morning, he found an email in his inbox from a young black computer science student that said, "Seeing you resist made me not give up on college. I just wanted you to know that." Marcus read the message twice, then rested his forehead on the table and sat in silence for long minutes. That was everything. It was exactly what he needed to continue, not for himself, but for all those who still faced what he had faced on that flight. Despite all the external changes, Marcus knew that the most challenging part was dealing with the small marks the episode had left inside him. He continued, traveling, but he avoided booking seat 2A, not out of fear, but out of respect for his own memory. That space had become a turning point, almost a personal monument. On one of the following flights, he noticed that the flight attendant who attended him seemed nervous upon seeing him. She was a young Latina, just over 25, who recognized him as soon as he boarded. "You're Marcus, right? I studied your case during training." She seemed worried about doing everything perfectly. He smiled and said, "Do it your way, it's enough." That was what he wanted to leave as a legacy, not the fear of making mistakes, but the awareness of getting it right. Humanity, responsibility, the courage to re-examine attitudes. On that same flight, as he gazed out the window at the clouds, Marcus thought about what that journey had taught him. It wasn't about winning arguments, nor about proving a point. It was about showing that what is unacceptable cannot be treated as routine, that dignity should not be something to be contested, and that, however structured an unjust system might be, it can be challenged by a simple act of refusal. He refused to give up his seat. But more than that, he refused to accept that this was normal. And that refusal, multiplied by thousands of others around the world, was what truly made a difference. The plane began its descent, and he felt his stomach twist slightly under the pressure of the altitude. It was a familiar sensation, but now, instead of discomfort, it was almost symbolic. Every profound change also caused a certain unease, and one had to learn to cross it. Upon disembarking, Marcus was greeted by a team from a local university where he was to give a lecture on ethics in corporate environments. It was a simple auditorium with wooden chairs and a wired microphone, nothing compared to the stages of major events he had been on before. But there, among students from different backgrounds, he felt something different. Genuine presence, attentive, listening. He told his story without embellishment, without heroics. He spoke about what he felt, about what almost made him give up, about the silence that often screams louder than offense. A young man in the front row raised his hand and asked, "Do you think you would have reacted the same way if you weren't famous?" Marcus hesitated before answering. Then he said, "Maybe not. But the point is that it shouldn't matter who I am. Respect should come before credentials." The room fell silent, and in that silence, he knew his words had reached their mark. At the end of the lecture, a professor approached him with teary eyes. She was a black woman with graying hair tied up in a high bun and a firm posture. "My son went through something similar on a school bus. They tried to say he couldn't sit in the front because it was for athletes. He's 12 and wears glasses. He's never played ball, but he was the only black boy in the group. I couldn't do anything that day. I felt so small. But today, seeing you here, I remembered that we can grow again." Marcus embraced her without a word. The strength of that moment needed no explanation. It was memories meeting, stories recognizing each other. It didn't matter the place, the age, or the context. There was a shared pain and now a common path to rebuilding. That night, back at the hotel, Marcus sat at the edge of the bed with his blazer still on and his shoes on. He was exhausted, not physically but mentally drained, as if every conversation, every memory, every glance carried an old weight. He turned on the television just to have some background noise and stared at his reflection in the room's mirror. Sometimes it was still hard to recognize himself. CEO, international reference, symbol of resistance. Inside, he still carried the South Chicago kid who used to draw chips and cables on a notebook page, trying to understand how the world worked. That part of him, he never wanted to lose. It was what kept him human. And it was then, in that intimate moment, that he decided to write a text. Without strategy, without an agenda, just writing. He opened his laptop and typed as if he were talking to someone who didn't exist yet. but who one day might need those words. You are going to be tested. They will take you out of your place, sometimes literally. They will make it seem like the mistake is yours for being where you are, but you will resist. Not because you're stronger, but because it's more just. And justice has a curious way of staying alive. It finds shelter in those who don't give up. He paused, reread, and saved the untitled file. It wasn't meant to be posted. Not yet. It was a reminder, a stored message, perhaps for a day when he himself needed to hear it again. He closed the laptop, slowly took off his shoes, and lay down, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in many months, he slept through the night without waking. His body still bore the wear, but that day his soul seemed to have finally found a safe corner to rest. In the following months, Marcus began receiving accounts from other black professionals who, inspired by his stance, decided to act in similar situations. An engineer fired for denouncing racist jokes at work. A manager who refused to train a new employee chosen by friendship and not by competence. A pilot who stepped away due to burnout after years of having to prove twice as much to be taken seriously. The stories arrived by email, direct messages, letters. Marcus read them all. Some he replied to, others he just read and filed away with the care of someone who understands the value of being heard. It was no longer just about him. It was about a collective that was beginning to find courage. The courage to break the silence, to acknowledge that what seemed normal should never have been accepted. That fed Marcus in a new way, not through indignation, but through the real sensation that the cycle was being broken. During a global innovation conference in Germany, Marcus was invited to give the closing lecture. The auditorium was immense, filled with executives, programmers, professors, and students. He stepped onto the stage, looked at the audience, and began differently. He did not talk about algorithms, nor about artificial intelligence. He began by recounting Flight 2746, about Seat 2A, about the public humiliation, and then about the choice to not be silent. There are people who think what happened to me was an exception. But what is an exception for some is routine for others. I just decided to show it. The silence in the room was absolute. At the end, given a standing ovation, Marcus left the stage with the same calm as if boarding an ordinary flight. For him, the most important thing had already been done. The story had been told, and told with truth. And when truth finds space, it becomes a tool. It changes things. Back in the United States, Marcus was surprised by an unusual invitation. A public school in Southeast Chicago wanted him to visit the robotics class that bore his name, Marcus Richardson Laboratory of Innovation and Technology. It was the same school where he had studied decades earlier, with broken desks, an improvised lab, and one computer for 30 students. Upon entering the classroom, he saw children with shining eyes, some wearing t-shirts with his face on them. It was surreal, not because of the tribute, but because of the awareness that he had become what he had once dreamed of, finding someone who showed it was possible. One of the 11-year-old boys approached with a tablet in hand and said, "I'm trying to make a code that detects when we're sad so it can play a cool song, but it's still giving errors." Marcus laughed and replied, "Error is part of it. Just don't stop trying." That, more than any prize or applause, made it all worthwhile. After the visit, Marcus walked through the streets of the neighborhood where he grew up. The houses were still modest, the asphalt pitted, but there was more color, more people on the sidewalks. He stopped in front of his grandmother's old house, now occupied by another family, and stood there for a few minutes just looking. There, among those thin walls and the constant smell of freshly brewed coffee, he had learned to get up after falling. On that sidewalk, he had learned to ride a bicycle, to fix radios, to understand that questions were more important than answers. He took out his phone and snapped a picture. He didn't post it. He kept it just for himself. It was like closing a cycle, not a full stop, but a moment of pause. So much had changed, but deep down he was still that curious boy who once refused to accept the place imposed on him. Shortly after, Marcus was invited to participate in a public hearing on racial discrimination in transportation environments. He sat among jurists, civil rights experts, and airline representatives. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't bring a PowerPoint presentation or statistics. He brought a printed copy of the boarding pass from Flight 2746 and placed it on the table. It all started with this: a number, a seat, a name. But behind that, there was a story. And it was that story that almost got erased by a system that insists on not seeing. His speech was harsh, direct, but filled with humanity. He pointed out structural flaws, denounced the culture of silence within companies, and made a provocation that echoed throughout the hall. How many here have given up space to maintain the comfort of their own privilege? No one answered, but the silence, once again, spoke for everyone. It was uncomfortable. It was necessary. At the end of the hearing, one of the airline representatives, an Asian American woman, approached him with a serious air. "Thank you for not choosing the path of hatred. You had every reason to do so, but you chose the path of impact." Marcus replied with a slight smile, "I chose the path that hurts and transforms at the same time. The path of truth." It was this truth that he now carried, not as a flag waving in the wind, but as baggage that reminded him where he came from and why he couldn't stop. Every step taken since that flight hadn't been driven by ambition, but by awareness. The awareness that power, when not shared, only serves to repeat oppression in a different package. And he didn't want to repeat anything. He wanted to redesign. And for that, he understood that every person who heard his story could be the starting point of a new path. Over time, the incident on the flight gradually receded from the headlines, but it was never forgotten in the right conversations. It became a case study, a reference in training sessions, a basis for codes of conduct and compliance regulations. Marcus continued to receive invitations, but now he chose more carefully where to invest his voice. He wanted every word, every appearance, to have real purpose. One evening, at a private dinner with leaders of social startups, one of the participants asked, "Do you think this kind of thing will still happen to you?" Marcus thought for a few seconds before answering, "Maybe yes, but today, when it happens, I won't be alone. And that changes everything." What was once isolation had now become a network, and he knew its value. He knew because he had once felt the opposite. And it was precisely that memory that kept him alert, yet hopeful. It was during one of those reflective nights that Marcus decided to publish that old text he had written in his hotel room months earlier, the one that began with, "You are going to be tested." Not a single comma was changed. He posted it just as it was. In less than an hour, the text went viral. Comments from young people, elders, professionals from all fields, saying that it seemed to have been written exactly for them. Marcus read each one in silence, with a contained smile. It wasn't about ego. It was about connection. It was about translating into words what so many felt, but didn't know how to say. By touching these deep layers of people, he understood that his mission was not to be an example, but to be a mirror, to show that it is possible to resist, yes, but also to rebuild, breathe, and move on. And that sometimes everything begins with a no, a firm no, spoken clearly in the face of a silent injustice. 1 year after Flight 2746, Marcus flew with Skylux again for the first time since the incident. The trip was short, just from Boston to New York, but symbolically carried immense weight. When he boarded the plane, he was greeted cordially but without exaggeration. No flattery attempts, no rehearsed apologies, just professionalism. And that, for him, was already a step forward. When he reached his seat, 2A, the same as before, he paused for a moment. He ran his hand over the seat back, as if testing the memory of the space. He sat down calmly, opened his notebook, and prepared to review a report. There were no cameras, no audience. It was just him, an ordinary flight, and the comfortable silence of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. He had managed to re-signify that place, and now, more than ever, that seat was his by right, a right earned with dignity. During the flight, he looked out the window and let his mind wander. He thought of those who came before him, the ones who were silenced, displaced, excluded. He also thought of those who would come after and of the world he hoped to leave as his legacy. Not a perfect world, but one where at least it was possible to be heard without having to shout. He smiled softly, remembering the boy who used to dismantle radios in his childhood and who now helped build bridges between people and companies. When the plane touched down in New York, Marcus didn't applaud as some passengers used to do. He simply gathered his things and walked calmly to the exit. As he passed the flight attendant, he received a discreet, "Welcome back, Mr. Richardson." He simply nodded, with a slight smile. He knew that that phrase, spoken naturally, not only closed a flight but a cycle, and this time he disembarked in peace. In the following days, Marcus didn't post on social media, didn't give interviews, didn't answer invitations. He needed silence, not the kind of silence that suffocates, but the one that heals, the kind that organizes inside us what the world disorganizes. He went back to waking up early, walking without his phone, having lunch calmly. He rediscovered small pleasures, like sharpening knives in the kitchen or watering the plants on the terrace. It was as if body and mind could finally inhabit the same time. He still received messages every day from people who wanted to hear his opinion, his guidance, his strength. But he knew there are moments to speak and moments simply to live. And at that moment, he only wanted to live, without carrying all the weights, without having to represent anything other than himself. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't Marcus Richardson, the CEO, the symbol, the case. He was just Marcus. Still, from time to time, he returned to the archive where he had stored the images from that flight, not to relive the pain, but to remember the turning point. That story, despite everything, was a reminder. The world only changes when someone refuses to accept the old way of doing things, and he had done that, not with shouts, not with revenge, but with presence, with integrity, with the courage to remain. Where they tried to remove him, and that courage, he knew, now lived in many people, people he would never meet, but who carry his story as fuel, and that was enough. He closed the notebook, looked out at the sky through the office window, and smiled. Not because everything was resolved, but because he had done his part, with truth, with dignity, with soul. And because, after everything, he continued on with the certainty that on that flight and in life, he would never again be displaced from his own place. If you felt that this story touched you in some way, leave a like, activate notifications, and subscribe to the channel. There's a lot of powerful stuff coming, and you are a part of it.